The night sky over the Nevada desert was ablaze with stars, casting a serene glow that always brought Ethan Carter a rare sense of calm. After years of urban chaos, he had exchanged the noise of city life for the tranquil isolation of his ranch. The sprawling desert, with its vast silence, had become his sanctuary, a life where nothing extraordinary ever happened. Until tonight. A sudden streak of light sliced through the sky, too erratic and fast to be a meteor. Ethan watched, heart pounding, as the object hurtled downward, its tail glowing brighter, spiraling out of control. Moments later, the earth shuddered with a deafening crash that echoed through the still night, sending tremors up his spine. Instinct overtook caution. Ethan grabbed his rifle and flashlight, jumping into his old truck, heart racing. As he sped toward the source, an eerie glow stained the horizon, growing brighter with each passing mile. Static filled the air, raising the hairs on the back of his neck. What greeted him was beyond imagination. A sleek, otherworldly vessel lay broken and half-buried in the sand. Its metallic surface shimmered beneath the moonlight, alien symbols etched into its hull. Smoke rose in hissing curls, the wreckage illuminated by a strange, pulsating light. As he approached, a figure emerged from the debris, a girl or something resembling one. Her skin glistened in the moonlight, a silver sheen that made her look otherworldly, her eyes unnervingly large and glowing faintly. Her slender frame was clad in a form-fitting suit, now torn and scorched, revealing the delicate, fragile nature of her body. Ethan's breath caught as he watched her collapse, her movements weak, vulnerable. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but something else, something deeper, compelled him to stay. "Hey!" His voice trembled as he knelt beside her, gently touching her shoulder. "Can you hear me?" Her glowing eyes flickered open, and in that moment, their gazes locked, his heart thudded as an inexplicable connection surged between them, as if her very soul had reached out to his. She nodded faintly, her lips parting as though to speak, but the words faltered, lost in the space between them. Gently, he lifted her into his arms, surprised at how light she felt, her skin cold against his warmth. For reasons he couldn't explain, Ethan felt protective, an overwhelming urge to keep her safe, even though she was a stranger, an alien in every sense of the word. But in that fleeting moment, as he carried her toward the truck, her head resting against his chest, Ethan knew his world had changed forever. Ethan drove in tense silence, glancing at the girl beside him, her fragile form bathed in the soft glow of the dashboard lights. His mind raced, torn between disbelief and the undeniable reality sitting next to him. Who was she? What had happened to her? And why did he feel this unshakable need to protect her? Back at the ranch, Ethan laid her down gently on his worn-out couch, careful not to aggravate her injuries. He grabbed a bowl of water and some bandages, kneeling beside her as he cleaned the soot and debris from her pale, silver skin. The glowing symbols on her suit dimmed with each passing second, as if the life was slowly draining from her. As he worked, he couldn't help but be mesmerized by her otherworldly beauty. There was something hauntingly delicate about her, an ethereal presence that stirred emotions in him he hadn't felt in years. His life had been devoid of deeper connections, and now, in the strangest of circumstances, he found himself drawn to this mysterious being in a way that defied logic. Just as he finished dressing her wounds, her eyes fluttered open, glowing softly like embers in the darkened room. She blinked, disoriented, before her gaze found Ethan, locking onto him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "Where am I?" Her voice was soft, melodic, but there was a strange echo to it, as though two voices spoke in unison. The sound tugged at something deep within him, stirring emotions that felt foreign, yet strangely familiar. "You're safe," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. He sat down beside her, the air thick with tension. "You crashed, out in the desert. I brought you back here." She struggled to sit up, wincing as pain rippled through her slender frame. Her glowing eyes darted around the room, anxiety etched in every line of her delicate face. I must leave," she whispered urgently. They will come for me. It is not safe here. Who will come? Ethan asked, his concern deepening. He leaned in closer, his brow furrowed in confusion. What are you talking about? Before she could answer, a loud bang reverberated from outside. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat as he shot to his feet, grabbing the rifle by the door. He barely had time to react and the front door burst open, revealing two men in dark suits, their expressions cold and calculated, like predators cornering their prey. Mr. Carter, one of them said, his voice dripping with authority. We're from the government. We need to take her. Now. Ethan's mind reeled. His eyes darted back to the girl, her expression had shifted from fear to terror, her eyes wide with recognition. She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper as she grabbed his arm. They're not who they say they are. They're hunters. The weight of her words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. In that instant, every instinct screamed at him to run. Without hesitating, he grabbed her hand and bolted toward the back door, his heart pounding in his chest as the men shouted behind them, their footsteps growing closer. They burst out into the open night air, Ethan dragging her toward his truck as the sound of gunfire erupted behind them. Bullets whizzed past, kicking up dirt as they dived into the cab. With a roar, the engine came to life, and they sped off into the darkness, the tires kicking up dust in their wake. The alien girl turned to Ethan, her face pale, eyes wide with gratitude and fear. You saved me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you." Ethan glanced at her, his mind still racing. "Who are you? Why are they after you?" "My name is Seris," she said, her voice steadying, though fear still lingered in her gaze. "I'm not from your world. Those men, they're part of a rogue group. They hunt my kind, trying to steal our technology. They sabotaged my ship, forced me to crash." Ethan's hands tightened around the steering wheel as her words sank in. Everything about his life, the quiet, the solitude, had been shattered in a single night. And yet, as crazy as it seemed, he couldn't turn back now. Not with Seris sitting next to him, her presence pulling at something deep inside him, something he couldn't explain. He glanced at her again, and for a brief moment, their eyes met, two souls from different worlds, bound together by fate. "We'll figure this out," he said, determination settling in his chest. "You're not alone anymore." Seris's lips parted in a soft, fragile smile, and for the first time since the crash, her fear seemed to ease. As they drove into the night, the desert stretching endlessly before them, Ethan felt something stir in his heart, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And maybe, just maybe, something more. For days, the desert became their only refuge. Ethan and Seris moved in silence, their shared fear palpable. The air felt heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of what they had yet to face. Seris, though weak, was recovering faster than he could have imagined. Her alien physiology allowed her wounds to heal rapidly, leaving behind faint scars that shimmered under the moonlight. Ethan found himself glancing at her more often than he intended. There was something about her, something not just alien, but deeply human in the way she looked at him, the way she spoke, the way her presence seemed to fill the empty spaces in his life. He had never been one for long conversations, but with Seris, he found himself wanting to know everything. And not just about her world, but about her. One evening, as they set up camp beneath the stars, the vast expanse of the desert spread out around them, Seris finally broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder what it's like, out there?" she asked softly, her voice a melodic whisper that seemed to blend with the night. She tilted her head upward, her glowing eyes reflecting the endless sea of stars above. Ethan followed her gaze, the weight of the moment settling between them. "Out there," he repeated. "You mean, in space?" Seris nodded, her expression softening. "It's vast. Beautiful in ways words can't capture. But it's also lonely. Her eyes flickered, and for a moment, Ethan thought he saw sadness in her gaze. You Earth people, you always look up, dreaming of what's beyond the stars. But out there, all we ever do is look back. We dream of the connections we left behind. Ethan was quiet for a moment, taking in her words. He had always thought of the stars as a symbol of freedom, of endless possibilities. But now, hearing her speak, he realized they could just as easily represent isolation. The vastness of space was a reminder of how small and alone you could feel, even in the midst of something infinite. I never thought about it that way, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. I guess. I've always been more focused on what's right in front of me. Seris smiled, a faint, wistful expression crossing her face. Maybe that's what I admire about your kind. You're grounded in ways we aren't. You feel deeply, live passionately. It's beautiful. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Her words, soft yet profound, tugged at something inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He had always considered himself a man apart, isolated, detached. But now, sitting here with Seris under the same stars he had gazed at so many times, he felt a connection that transcended the boundaries of their worlds. What's your world like? Ethan asked, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. He didn't want to break the fragile thread of intimacy between them, but he couldn't help his curiosity. Seris looked at him, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. My world is advanced. More so than Earth. We've harnessed technology that allows us to travel between galaxies, to manipulate matter, even to alter time in small ways. But, we lost something along the way. Lost what? Ethan asked, leaning in closer. She sighed, her expression distant. Emotion. We evolved beyond certain primal feelings, fear, anger, even love. It was a choice, made in the pursuit of progress. But now, seeing you, being here, I realize we lost something far more valuable. Ethan felt a tightness in his chest as her words settled over him. He couldn't imagine a world without emotions, without the things that made people human. It made him ache to think Seris had grown up in such a place, deprived of the very feelings that connected them now. You don't seem like you've lost that, Ethan said gently, his gaze searching hers. Seris blinked, her eyes locking onto his. No, she whispered. I haven't. Not since I met you. Her confession hung in the air between them, charged with a raw intensity neither of them could ignore. Ethan felt a pull, something magnetic, drawing him toward her. Slowly, tentatively, he reached out, taking her hand in his. Her skin was cool to the touch, but there was a warmth in her eyes that made his heart race. For a long moment, they sat in silence, their hands intertwined, the desert night stretching out around them. The stars above seemed to pulse with a distant light, as if reflecting the quiet connection growing between them. I don't understand this, Ethan finally said, his voice low and rough with emotion. But I know I don't want it to end. Seris looked at him, her eyes soft and filled with something Ethan could only describe as wonder. Neither do I, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. But I'm afraid it will. They won't stop until they find me. And when they do. She trailed off, but Ethan understood. The hunters were out there, and they wouldn't rest until Seris was captured, or worse. But right now, in this moment, Ethan didn't care. He wasn't going to let her face them alone. We'll face them together, he said, his voice steady with resolve. I won't let them take you. Seris smiled, a soft, fragile smile that made Ethan's heart ache. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. Ethan didn't respond with words. Instead, he pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her in a gentle embrace. Seris rested her head against his chest, her body relaxing against his, as if, for the first time since the crash, she felt truly safe. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other under the stars, the weight of their uncertain future hanging over them like a shadow. But in that moment, they found solace in each other, a connection that defied the boundaries of their worlds and the dangers that awaited them. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. Ethan held Seris close, feeling her breath slow against his chest, a rhythm that mirrored his own heartbeat. For a moment, the world around them faded away, the looming danger, the vast desert, the constant fear. All that existed was the quiet space between them, filled with an intimacy that Ethan had never known before. But as peaceful as the moment was, reality crept back in. The hunters were still out there, relentless, and it wouldn't be long before they found their trail again. Ethan knew that staying still was no longer an option. He gently pulled back, his eyes meeting Seris's. "We should keep moving," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of the inevitable. "We can't stay out here much longer." Seris nodded, though a flicker of sadness passed over her features. "I know," she whispered. "But thank you, for this." Her hand lingered against his chest for a moment longer before she pulled away completely, gathering her things. Ethan doused the fire, kicking sand over the embers until they were nothing but cold ash. The night sky above them was darker now, the stars feeling more distant, almost indifferent to the struggles of those beneath them. The temperature had dropped, and a sharp wind swept across the desert, making Seris shiver slightly. "Here," Ethan said, pulling off his jacket and draping it around her shoulders. She looked up at him, her glowing eyes full of gratitude, but there was something else, something deeper that neither of them dared to speak aloud. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible against the wind. Ethan gave her a small nod, then motioned to the truck. "Let's go." They drove through the night in silence, the only sounds the occasional rumble of the engine and the wind whistling past the open windows. Ethan's mind raced with thoughts of what was to come, but his heart kept returning to the moment they had just shared. He had never imagined feeling so deeply for someone, let alone someone from another world. Seris sat beside him, staring out the window, her eyes distant as if lost in thought. Ethan wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but he held back, unsure if now was the right time. There was something fragile about the connection they had formed, as if one wrong word could shatter it. After a long stretch of silence, Seris spoke. "You don't have to do this, Ethan. You don't owe me anything." Ethan glanced at her, surprised by the sudden shift in her tone. "I'm not doing this because I feel like I owe you," he said, his voice steady. "I'm doing this because I want to. I can't explain it, but I feel like I'm supposed to help you." Seris turned to him, her glowing eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and sadness. "You don't understand what you're getting into. The hunters, they won't stop until they have me. They'll kill anyone who stands in their way. I can't ask you to risk your life for me." "You didn't ask," Ethan replied, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "I'm choosing to." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of Ethan's words settling between them. Seris lowered her gaze, her fingers tracing the edge of the jacket he had given her. "You remind me of someone," she said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. "Who?" Ethan asked, his curiosity piqued. Seris hesitated before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone I lost a long time ago. Someone who believed in things like honor and loyalty. Someone who cared for me." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. He could feel the weight of her past pressing in on her, but he didn't want to pry. Instead, he reached out and gently placed his hand over hers, offering her what little comfort he could. Seris looked down at their hands, then back up at him. "I'm not sure how this ends, Ethan," she said softly. "But I'm glad you're here with me." Ethan squeezed her hand lightly. "We'll figure it out together." As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold, they reached the edge of a small mountain range. Seris pointed to a narrow path that wound its way up into the rocks, hidden from the main roads. "We can hide up there for a while," she said. "It'll give us some time to think." Ethan nodded and steered the truck onto the path, the tires kicking up dust as they ascended into the mountains. The terrain grew rougher, but Ethan navigated it with ease, his mind focused on the plan ahead. When they finally stopped, Ethan helped Seris out of the truck, and they hiked a short distance to a secluded spot where the rocky cliffs provided cover. From this vantage point, they could see the vast expanse of the desert below. Anyone approaching would be visible for miles. As they sat down, Seris leaned against the rock, her face turned toward the sky. "It's beautiful here," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet awe. "So much more alive than where I'm from." Ethan glanced at her, watching the way her features softened in the morning light. He had seen beauty in the desert before, but now, sitting beside Seris, it felt different. More profound. "Maybe," he said, his voice low, "but it's not just the place. It's who you're with." Seris turned to him, her glowing eyes locking onto his. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of their connection growing heavier with every passing second. And then, without thinking, Ethan leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a gentle kiss. Seris didn't pull away. Instead, she kissed him back, her hands reaching up to cradle his face as the world around them seemed to disappear. There was no danger here, no hunters, no fear, just them, together, in a moment of pure, unguarded emotion. When they finally pulled apart, Seris rested her forehead against his, her breath warm against his skin. "I've never felt this way before," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Not with anyone." Ethan smiled, his hand gently caressing her cheek. "Neither have I." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms as the sun climbed higher in the sky. For the first time since the crash, they allowed themselves to simply be, free from the fear and the uncertainty, if only for a little while. But even as they held each other, Ethan knew this peace wouldn't last forever. The hunters were still out there, and soon, they would come for Seris again. But now, after everything they had been through, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her go. No matter what it took.